I know it is really confusing when we talk about Azure Container Apps networking. There are so many options to select with environment, with ingress, without ingress, within environment, outside of environment, limited to VNet, accept traffic from anywhere, and so on. I'm going to talk about real world scenarios of allowing access to a container app and then to implement those scenarios, what actual network configuration you really need. Hello and welcome all to my YouTube channel Azure Beyond Demos. My name is Kunal Chandratre, and with this introduction, let us directly have a view at my application details which I plan to host on container apps. Content web is a container and it is UI for conference website. Content API is an API layer which provides information about speaker session. Content web calls content API to get the details. Both of these containers are uploaded on Azure Container Registry already. And for simplicity, I'm not considering database in this application as anyways you usually will not host database on container apps. I will cover a total four real world use cases of hosting container apps and related networking configuration. Number one, web UI application is accessible over the internet, and the API layer is accessible only inside the container app environment, not even the VNet also, only within the container app environment. Then point number two or scenario two, content web UI application accessible over private network from other VNets and content API layer accessible only again inside the container app environment. Point number three, where content web application will be accessible only from other VNets over a private network, and content API will also be able to access from other VNets over private network and outside of container app environment. So from scenario one and two, as opposed to accessing the content API only inside the container app, in point number three, we are going to actually allow access outside the container app environment, but over the private network. That's scenario three. Point number four, content web application is accessible over the internet, but API layer is accessible only within the VNet or over the private network or across other peered VNets. And point number five is content web and API both are accessible over the internet. Let's start with scenario one. Before going to scenario one, let us first understand Azure resources I am creating and why. In real world, most of the application will be deployed in a VNet owned by customers, and I have hardly seen anybody deploying in managed VNet. Therefore, for explanations, I am going to use dedicated profile-based environment of container apps. Now, dedicated profile-based environment of container apps allows you to deploy a container app in your own VNet. Then, while creating the container app, I will be creating Ingress. As my applications are accessible only over the HTTP, Ingress will be mandatory. If you're running background jobs, then Ingress may not be mandatory. Okay. Then I have created two VNets. One is called as Azure Container App VNets, ACA VNet, which has two subnets, web subnet, app subnet. Web will be used for content web, and ideally app to be used for content API. Okay, but we will see how the scenarios unfold. Then Hub VNet, in which I am going to deploy a virtual machine to check cross VNet connection and demonstrate that from other peered VNets, I am able to reach to my container app based on the scenario chosen. Container registry is there, which already have the containers for content web and content API deployed. Then I will need Azure Private Zone. This will be used for the internal container app DNS resolution. If you plan to use your own DNS server in VNet, you will just need to change that DNS server IP in ACA VNet and Hub VNet both. In my case, I'm going to use Azure Private Zone, and I will be using or linking ACA VNet and Hub VNet to this particular private zone. Now let's move to scenario one. So let's look at the scenario one. The solution architecture for the same is on the screen. Scenario one is content web over the internet and API only inside the container app environment. So here the environment is created as public so that it gets a public IP, and the same public IP will be used by all container apps which are exposed to the internet. Now, in our case, it will be content web. Okay, content web we are exposing to internet. Now, content web is hosted with external ingress. Okay, therefore, from internet it will be reachable. Now, content API is configured with Ingress as limited to container app environment. Okay, as it needs to be accessible from content web, and content web is in the environment named as public environment. Content API needs to be deployed in the same environment, and hence it will be deployed in the same subnet. This is configured with Ingress as limited to container app environment, so it won't be reachable from the internet. I hope I'm clear. Now, so here, if you need content API to be deployed in app subnet, then you will need to create a new environment in the app subnet, and then it will be deployed into that. Now, in current scenario, I need to access within the same environment the content API. Therefore, it automatically gets deployed in the web subnet only. All right, so I hope it is clear. Now on the Azure portal, I'm going to show what options I'm choosing, which are shown in the bottom of this diagram. So I'm on the Azure portal and I'm going to create the container app. So this is my container app name, which is content web. I'm going to use the image for container. So I'll select container image. The region I'm selecting at Central India, and then let's now talk about creating the environment. So my environment name is public environment. There is no next button, so you have to click on this tab. I don't want to use consumption profile because I'm going to use my own VNET, so I need dedicated profile. So I'll say this is public workload profile, and here in the size I will choose the size as D4. Select it. Now by default it is 3 instances. I will make it as 1 instance for simplicity. Then on monitoring, I'll not change anything. On the networking, this is important, you have to select enable public network access. Use your own virtual network. Here my virtual network is ACA VNet, and the subnet is going to be web subnet because this is content web. And virtual IP we have to select here as external so that it gets a public IP. Your environment will get a public IP. Then no change on infrastructure resource group, let it be as it is, and no private endpoint. And then I'll click on create. Now this completes the configuration of container app environment. Now let's talk about the container configuration. So here I'm going to use my container registry. I already have the container web container already added into my registry. So I'll select its version, provide the necessary scope. And now what important change we need to do? Instead of consumption, select the workload profile that we have selected. This is quite a big for this container, so I change the size to minimum possible. And then on ingress, select enabled and make it as accepting traffic from anywhere, and the port has to be 3000. Okay, because this is the port for my container on which my application is running. But when you access it from public, it will be still 443 or 80. This target port should be same on which your application will be running inside the container. Hope that's clear. And then just go and create it. The content web application is deployed, and this is the URL. Okay, now if I click on this, it opens the home page. Now when I click on this speakers or session, it should be talking to content API. And right now there is no data being retrieved because we have not deployed content API limited to container environment. So let's now deploy that one. So I am on container apps page. I will say create another container app. Now subscription and resource group remains the same. The app name is content API. Okay. The environment we plan to use the same, so no change here. Container image. Then next. I will select the registry in which my container image is present, content API. We will, and then important change as always, I will deploy it into my workload profile, and I will reduce the size of this container. Okay, and then Ingress. This is critical. On Ingress, here we need to select limited to container apps environment, and the application or API running inside this container uses port 3001. So I will use that. Okay. So why this? Because I want this API to be accessible only from the content web, not outside of my container app environment. This is our scenario one, and that's why we have selected this setting on Ingress. Hope you're able to understand. Then just review and create. So content API is deployed, and now this is the URL that you see on my screen, and I will just try to access it. And as expected, as I'm trying to access it publicly, it is not reachable. Okay, because we have configured Ingress as a limited to container app environment. Now in that container app environment, what is the other container app I'm running? That is my content web. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to access content API from content web container app. Okay, so let's do that. So I went into content web and clicked on console, and here I'll select BNSH and then connect. So let it connect. Okay. So now here I need to access the URL of my content API. Let's do that. I'm just making a simple curl command. Sorry, paste. And here is the output. Okay. Let me show that again to you. I say paste. And if I go up, you can see I have pasted curl my content API URL slash speaker. So that gives me the speaker's information. Okay. So this is not accessible on the internet, but inside the content web, I'm able to access it because it is part of the same environment. So here it completes the scenario one. Now as a bonus tip, now let's say I want to configure this URL as an environment variable in the content web so that content web can access the data from content API. Let's do that. In content web, I clicked on containers. Here you will see an option to set the environment variables. I will select that. Add name of my environment variable is going to be not this, content API URL, source as a manual entry, and value will be the URL of my content API. Save as a new revision. Now let's click on, after saving the revision, URL of content web, and now I click on speakers, which should give a call to content API, and I'm able to get the details of speaker. I'm able to get the details of sessions as well. This is how you use it. With this, now let's move to scenario 2. In scenario 2, we plan to host content web over a private network only. Means it will be accessible only inside of the same VNet in which we have created the environment, as well as if there are any other VNets which are paired with this VNet, then my content web will be accessible. So unlike scenario one, where for the environment you created, you had received the public IP. Okay. But in scenario two, you will receive a private IP. Okay. And this private IP will be from the same subnet in which we are creating our private environment. Okay. Now to access this content web application over a private IP, I'm going to have peering between Hub VNet and ACA VNet. In Hub VNet, I have deployed a sample VM called as Hub VM, and from that I will be accessing the URL of my content web container app application. Okay. Now this is private access, so the URL of my content web should resolve to private IP of the environment. To do that resolution, we will have to use Azure Private DNS Zone. In Azure Private DNS Zone, I will create a zone called as Azure Container Apps.io, and whatever the URL that I have, except for Azure Container Apps.io, I will use the rest of the URL as you see over here and create a record set for the private IP of my environment. Okay, this is how I will do it. And then this DNS resolution should be able to do the resolution of content web URL to actual IP, and my application should be accessible from the hub VM. Important step is that we will have to map both these VNets or link both these VNets to this DNS zone. Now, instead of this DNS zone, if you are using your own DNS server, then this exact same entry you will have to do in your DNS server. That's it. And you have to make sure that the same DNS server is being used for resolution in Hub VNet and ACA VNet also. Okay. All right. I hope I'm clear. Now, let's actually try it on the Azure portal. Okay, I am on the create container apps page. I will select create container app, select the right subscription, right resource group. I'm deploying content web, so I will name my app as that. I'll use container image. The region I'm selecting as Central India, right? Why? Because I'm sitting in India, that's why. Then create new environment. Now my environment name is going to be private environment. Okay, I'm not going to use consumption profile. I want to use my own profile, dedicated one. So I'll say private workload profile. I will choose the size as, let's say, the lowest size. For now it is T4, so I will select that one. I will bring the number of instances to 1 for testing purpose. Click on add, no change on monitoring. On the networking, this is critical. Select disable network access from the public internet. Use your own VNet. Yes, select the VNet, ACA VNet in my case. Subnet is going to be web because I'm deploying content web. Virtual IP has to be internal. No change on the infrastructure group, and enable private endpoints. Do not change anything. Let it be to no, and then create it. Okay. After this, we will go to the next stage where we will select the container registry. I will select the required container image, content web, image tag as v1. Then make sure to you change workload profile to the one that you created. I will reduce the size of my container. And then on the ingress, this is again very critical. You have to mark it as enabled, but ingress traffic should be set to limited to VNet. When you say limited to VNet, means your container app is accessible from the same VNet and across all other VNets which are peered to this VNet. Okay, although it is not mentioned over here that you can reach to this app from peered VNets also, but this is what it means. It's not there. Thank me later. Okay, and then my port on which my container is running, and then simply create it. Okay, let's look at the settings for container app of content API. So environment has to be same because I want to deploy in the same environment. Then on the container side, we selected the container registry and everything, and made sure that we are selecting our private dedicated workload profile, reduce the size. And on the ingress, the important changes, we have to select limited to container apps environment because we want content API to be limited and accessible only within the environment with the port on which my application will be running inside the container. That's it. My content web and content API both are deployed for scenario 2. So I click on this URL and it is not accessible over the internet because my content web is configured only for limited to the VNet ingress. Similarly, content API is configured for limited to container app environment, so that is also not accessible. Now in my hub VNet, I have hub VM, okay, and that hub VM is paired with ACA VNet, right? So it is expected that it should be reachable. And if I copy paste my content web URL, that is also not accessible. Even if I do NS lookup, it's not resolving. The reason is I need to update my private DNS zone with that URL. Okay, so let's do that. In my private DNS zone, I will click on add. The name is going to be content web URL. So I will copy that URL over here. Okay, but container apps.io is already part of my DNS zone. So I will remove the trailing and HTTPS. IPv4 address is going to be of my private environment. This is my private environment IP. I copy it and I paste, and let's say add. Now while this is getting add, you can see that in virtual network links, I have both the VNets added in this my DNS zone. Let's try NS lookup again. Now it is resolving, and let's try the URL in hub VNet, and we are able to reach there also. Okay, so our private DNS zone records are working fine. This is how you can implement scenario 2. And one more important thing, for content API, we need not make an entry into private DNS zone, because this content API in scenario 2, it's still limited to the container app environment only. It is not going to get access from other peer VNets, so no need of making an entry into the private DNS zone, and it should be reachable directly from our content web app. Hope that clarifies. Let's move to now scenario 3. Scenario 3 is a variation from scenario 2. The only change is that now the content API will also be accessed from other VNets or peered VNets. Okay, so what change it has to happen? So earlier we were deploying the content API in the same environment, which I'm drawing with the circle, but now we have to create a new environment in app subnet and deploy the content API in that. So this is what we need to do, which is tick marked on the screen. So let's do that on the Azure portal right away. Create container app screen. My container app name is going to be content API. Now this environment I had used for content web. Now we need to change that as per our scenario 3. So I will name it as a private environment for API layer. Then in the workload profiles, now we will have to create a new dedicated workload profile, which is, let's say, API workload profile. Okay, we are not going to use the same environment as content web, so new dedicated workload profile will be required for content API. Let's reduce the size for simplicity of this demo. Then no change on monitoring. In the networking, same setting as that of content web, wherein public network access is disabled. We use our own VNet, ACA VNet. Subnet is changed now. It is going to be app subnet instead of web. Virtual IP is going to be internal. No change on private endpoints. And then create. And then here on the container, let's select the registry, content API image, the repository image tag, select the dedicated workload profile as API workload profile. Okay, then change the size on the ingress, say enabled, limited to the VNet. In scenario 1 and 2, we had limited to container app for content API. Now we want content API to be accessible on other VNets but over private IP, so limited to VNet and the port on which it runs, and then just create it. Is deployed into the new environment. Now, if I try to access my content API from my hub VNet, which is paired with AC VNet, I'm still not able to reach. Similarly, if I do NS lookup, I'm not able to reach to my content API. So what do I need to do? I need to add the DNS record in my private DNS zone. So this is my URL of private content API, and my private environment has this IP. So in the private DNS zone, I will add the record for content API against the private IP of my environment and click add here. And then after adding this, let's try again. Now, if I access content API with slash speakers, after adding the DNS record, I'm able to get the data as you can see on my screen. And if I do the resolution again, it is able to result to the same IP of my environment, which is specifically created for deploying the content API. That completes the scenario 3. In scenario 3, if you had observed at the top, in private DNS zone, I had mentioned the record set only for content web, but I had not mentioned record set for content API. If you have noticed this, then that's amazing. I mean, you were really attentive. But if not, this was missed over here. So we need to add the record set for content API also over here, and that is what I did in my demo just now that I showed when we changed the private DNS zone record, or when we added the private DNS zone record. Okay, so now let's move to scenario 4. In scenario 4, the content web will be accessible over the internet, and content API will be accessible privately outside of the container environment, but and across other private peered subnets as well. Okay, so I'm not going to showcase this on portal, but we will discuss the changes over here only. So your environment for web will be public environment for your content web. Okay, then you will create, as always, workload profile as dedicated. Public network access for your environment will be enabled. Use your own VNet. VIP will be external. Private endpoints no. Ingress to be enabled with traffic from anywhere, so that from internet it can be reachable, as you see blue line on the screen. For the content API, it will be accessible only on the peered VNets. For that, as always, create the dedicated profile. Then, in the environment of your network, make public access as disabled. Use your own VNet. VIP as internal. Private endpoints no. Ingress enabled with limited to VNet. And for your content API, you will have to make a DNS entry so that the resolution can happen from other peered VNets. So I hope these all four scenarios gave you a deeper insights into the network configuration for Azure Container Apps. If there is any other scenario that you would like me to cover, please add your comments in the comment section box, and I will try to create a video for that. Thank you so much for listening to me.